All right, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Tracy. I am Senior Editor of Women at Work and Features Editor for the Times-Union. Thank you for taking, I assume it's your lunch break, but for part of your day. Thank you for spending some of it with us as we dive into part of the Women at Work View on Women 2020 poll. And the topic today is women and families. So thanks for joining us. We're going to get kicked off soon. This is the second of three conversations about the View on Women poll, the VOW poll, which is a national attitudinal survey that explores implicit bias toward women. And that poll is done in partnership with the College of St. Rose Women's Leadership Institute and sponsored by the Martin Group. And we do want to take a quick minute to thank our Women at Work corporate partners who support us in all that we do. So we ask that you support them. That includes Bank of America, the College of St. Rose, Godfrey Financial Associates, the Community Loan Fund of the Capital Region, Brand 21, Frank Adams Jewelers. And we'd like to announce that our newest corporate partner is Palette of Saratoga Springs and soon to be in Schenectady. So let's talk about a little bit of what's going to happen today. Our principal researcher for the VOW poll, Dr. Eve Walter, is going to be presenting some data, followed by a conversation with Eve and our other panelist, Alonza Alozi. And I do want to have a heads up here. Several of the questions that Eve will be presenting and that we'll be discussing today surround domestic violence and intimate partner violence. That is something that both of our panelists have a little bit of expertise on, and it does involve that women and the family relationship. And a little bit of context on the poll. Some of you may have remembered the View on Women poll from 2017, which was all throughout New York State. This time around, it's a nationwide poll. It's a web-based survey of 3,500 randomly selected adults across the country. And if you want a little bit more context on the View on Women poll and some other statistics, if you go to the Capital Region Women at Work page, Facebook page, we have our first video from a couple of weeks ago on that, and that dives a little bit more into the context of the poll that I'm sure Eve will get into. And speaking of which, let me introduce Dr. Eve Walter, who will be presenting some of the results on the poll. So Dr. Eve Walter is the director of the Eden Research and Evaluation and a senior research scientist at New York's Institute for Family Health. Eve holds a PhD in epidemiology from the State University at Albany's Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Her personal research agenda centers primarily on women's health and women's status in the United States and globally. Her publications include over 15 academic papers on women's issues, including domestic violence, contraception, and breastfeeding, as well as a documentary film about women's sexual exploration. So Eve, please take it away.
Thank you. As Sarah mentioned, the View on Women poll is a national survey. It's the only one of its kind that looks specifically at implicit bias towards women across the country. And so I just want to clarify what implicit bias is. This is the idea of the feelings that people hold that they may not even realize that they hold. This topic today, where we're looking at families and specifically intimate partner violence, is really important to me because in many ways, it's what initiated my interest in doing this survey in the first place. I've been an intimate partner violence researcher for over 20 years. And back in the late 1990s, when looking at intimate partner violence and other types of violence, specifically in New York City, what I noted and other people had noted as well who did this kind of work was that while violence had declined in New York City and across the entire country, intimate partner violence had not declined at all, which led to the question of why. Why is that different from violence in general? And one of the explanations, which I'm not going to take full credit for because there are other people who are in this world who had these same kinds of conversations, was that perhaps not everyone agrees that this type of behavior is wrong. Now, if this is the first time you're hearing that kind of idea, I could put it in context of something like disciplining a child, that there's some people who believe that spare the rod, spoil the child is good parenting, and other people who see that as child abuse. And so certain kinds of acts like that are aggressive acts within a private family, some people believe are not wrong. They're just private acts between a family, and there's other people who believe they are wrong. And so I wanted to know, how do we feel in the United States? Do we think these behaviors are wrong? And I couldn't find anything. There was nothing in the entire country. There's no research studies. Yeah, I may have found one really small one of about 40 people in one town, but there's nothing in this country. But then I looked outside of this country, and in other countries, they did have a series of questions. The most common is a set of questions, and I was not the person who wrote these questions, so don't hold this against me. But basically, when is it okay to beat your wife? And it provided different scenarios. So if she burns the food or neglects the children, and it asked people within that country, the general population, males, females, young and old, whether they agreed or disagreed with those statements. And what I found was some really interesting patterns and really interesting enlightening information about where people were at in terms of believing these behaviors were okay. But again, nothing in our country. And so I really started this poll initially because I wanted to have those answers. I wanted to know how people felt about intimate partner violence here in this country. But as this grew and this idea developed, I started partnering with people in women in political science and education. And we ended up expanding the poll to really look at these other topics, such as women in the workplace, women in education, women in policy. But today's talk is really, really special and important to me because this is really the motivation for this poll in the first place. And so with that, I will start with the first slide. Okay, so again, many of these questions were questions that came from other surveys. And so the first 3 slides are questions that were asked in other countries as well. So the first asked whether the individuals agreed with the statement, it's a wife's obligation to have sex with her husband, even if she doesn't feel like it. Now, in our country, recently, this was determined to be illegal. This is rape to have sex if you don't want to. Maybe we have this gray area because the wife is choosing to do it or not, but this is a very significant issue regarding the power differential between a husband and a wife, or any 2 partners. And so what we see here is the pattern that males are consistently more likely to agree with this statement than females. And that we also see for both females and males, we're seeing this increase as they move from 18 years old to 45-year-olds, where 36 to 45-year-old male and females are the most likely to agree with this statement. And then we start seeing a decline as individuals get older, steadily from 46 over to 66. The next slide, please. Another question is, a husband partner is justified if he hits his wife or partner if he finds out that she's been unfaithful. This was one of the many questions that I had found in other countries of when is it okay for a husband to beat his wife. And I picked the unfaithful for the one in the United States because that was one that was consistently had a higher percentage of people agreeing that that was a circumstance that made it okay. And so we see a kind of similar, but not totally similar pattern here. Once again, we have, for the most part, males being more likely to agree with the statement than females. However, they seem to be pretty close among the 46 to 65-year-old males, as well as the 66, that they're very similar. We have to consider there's about a 2% margin of error. So there's not that much difference in the older cohort. Can you please, thank you. And what's really relevant here is this idea that for 36 to 45-year-old males, over 1 in 4 believe that it's okay to beat your wife or partner if she feels if he finds out that she's been unfaithful. And we also, it's interesting, but not necessarily surprising, is that we're seeing younger males, the 18 to 25, being slightly higher than the 26 to 35. Again, with the margin of error, it's pretty similar, but we're definitely seeing a decline here that is a little bit more pronounced than the previous question. Next slide, please. So another question is, wives can avoid being beaten by their husband if they knew when to stop talking. I have to say that I was advised not to include this question because when we were having conversations about choosing these questions, people who hadn't been doing this kind of research, as I had been, just thought, how could anyone ever say yes to this question? Well, as you see, quite a few people said yes to this question. Once again, we see that males are more likely to agree with this statement than females are, and that this rises to over 35% of males who are 36 to 45 believing that a wife could avoid being beaten by her husband if she knew when to stop talking. And so what's important about these is in each of these situations, it's very much about victim blaming. Well, first we have that it's a wife's obligation to have sex with her husband. We have that if a wife is abused by her husband and because he found out or thinks she was unfaithful, then she probably brought this upon herself. And this idea that women who speak back or talk back to their husbands, they're just asking for it. They're asking to be beaten. And this, I did not pick the word beaten or stop talking. This has been used in, like I said, in other surveys, but they're pretty severe. Like there's not a subtlety to this, the wording of this kind of question. And yet here we have this very strong this strong response, especially by the men who are in that early age of this earlier marital age, this 26 to 45-year-old males, especially the 36 to 45-year-old males ascribing to this. So before we advance to the next one, these questions, these past three questions really relate to very specific actions and whether it was okay to should have sex or it's okay to justify partner violence. So I want to remind you of what these findings basically have. That we have, like, for females, it ranges from 5 to 15% of them are supporting this idea that sometimes it's okay to abuse your wife. And for males, it gets as high as 35%. And so holding that in mind, that there's this relatively high amount of people who do agree with these statements, which incidentally, there is a correct answer, right? The correct number would be 0%, that it's never okay. But we have this range of 5 to 15 in females and 35, up as high as 35 in males. So then we have to wonder, well, how does this translate into policy then? How do these relate? So we can move to the next slide. And so we ask a question of whether it's how much of a priority is reducing domestic violence and sexual violence. And this specifically focuses on those people who say it's not that important. And so this is actually quite positive, that it's very low. Most people feel that it is important to reduce domestic violence and sexual assault. And maybe it's interesting, our younger people, again, are a little bit less likely to think it's important, but for the most part, I'm going to give everybody credit here to say that almost everyone thinks it's pretty important. And so here we have this interesting imbalance because it's something that we as a society should do something about. It's something that government should do something about, domestic violence and sexual assault. And yet it's still the woman's fault when it occurs. So then we're going to look at some more slides relating to policy, and they may seem to not relate to partner violence, but in many ways they still do, because it's really about power differentials between males and females. So let's move to the next slide. So now we're asking about whether safe reproductive health care is important. And these are the people who say it's not too important. So here we're really struck. If you recall, everybody was below 5% on saying that it's not too important to do something about domestic violence and sexual assault. And we're going up to almost a quarter of, especially in the males, the older males, saying that safe reproductive healthcare is not too important. Now, safe reproductive healthcare is a type of partner violence. It is a type of, it's a control over a woman's body. And yet here we have close to 1 in 5 males feeling it's not too important. Now, what's also kind of interesting is before, if you recall, it was the older generations, the older males and females who were more likely to not support the acts of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And yet now we have this older cohort saying, I don't think that doing something about reproductive health care is important. While before we had our younger cohort more likely to justify partner violence, but now we have, like, in our 26 to 45 these males and females are more likely to say that it is important. That's why their numbers are low, and it impacts them directly. And so here they are, that their actual experience is influencing their implicit bias. The next slide. So we also ask questions about whether government should help ensure that working women have access to paid maternity leave. And this is the percent who disagree with this or are neutral. And so again, you have slightly more males, sometimes considerably more males disagreeing than females. And again, we see this interesting pattern. We have our youngest cohort, our youngest males, 18 to 25, and our oldest males, 46 and older, who are disagreeing about paid maternity leave, while our males who are 26 to 45, which is the age that would most likely have young children, are agreeing that there should be government support for access to maternity leave, which is also speaks to the idea that our implicit bias are very much guided by our life experiences. What we go through, what we see in our lived experiences influence how our implicit biases are. I think there's one more. Is that true? Yes. And so government should help ensure that working women have access to safe, affordable daycare. And this is the percent that disagree or neutral. And again, we have that same idea. We have these younger males, these 18 to 25-year-olds, close to 1 in 4 of them saying this is not important. And then again, from the 55 and older, even more than 1 in 4 of these males are feeling like this is not that important. But our males who are within that age group, 26 to 45, those who have these young children are more likely to want to believe that there should be government support for working mothers for affordable daycare. So again, we have this very interesting dichotomy between specific, very direct questions about intimate partner violence and intimate partner relationships, and that seem to show an inverse when we have questions about policy, again, influenced primarily likely by the lived experience of these men, 26 to 45, who were really had damaging responses to the direct questions, but when it came to policies that would obviously impact them, they tended to be much more supportive of these policies. Thank you.
Wow. I mean, I remember the first time around when the survey came out in 2017 with the New York cohort, and we presented some of the findings at our Women at Work Summit. And it was these kind of questions that really elicited the most, literally the most audible gasps, but some of the stronger reactions out of some of this information. So Eve, when you look at some of the results from that 2017 poll and the results from this time around, were there any big differences in these reactions and the way that people answer these questions?
Yes, some good, some bad. So what's really interesting is, as a researcher, I would generally say that 3 years is not enough to see a change. But the 3 years from 2017 to 2020, in terms of women and in terms of intimate partner violence and those kinds of things, have been huge, because we had the Women's March and we had the Me Too movement. So we had two major national and worldwide influences that would be reasonable to impact how people are answering these questions. So it was kind of interesting that I got to look at 2017 compared to 2020. One of the things I hadn't mentioned before, but when I had done an exploration of other countries looking at these justifications of partner violence, what I found was very consistently the youngest women were more likely to justify this kind of behavior. That 18 to 25 were the most likely, which is really important because that's also the group that's at highest risk of intimate partner violence. So the group that's at highest risk are more likely to justify it. What I'm happy to say is that in the 3 years, we've seen some sign of improvement among the 18 to 25-year-old women and men who are starting to recognize these being not justifiable. However, it's gotten worse for the 26 to 35-year-old women. In each of those same questions, obliged to have sex, can avoid being beaten if they could just keep their mouth shut, justified abuse if they're unfaithful, 26 to 35-year-old women have gone the wrong direction. And so we'll have to see in ideally 5 years what happens next, but it was pretty sad to see that result.
Yeah, I mean, really, really sobering statistics that come around. But hopefully, when we go through more of the program, we can talk about, some forward spin, what can be done, to make those answers, absolutely 0%, like you had said, in an ideal world. But before we do that, a couple of things. If anybody who is watching this right now has any questions for Eve or Anzala when I introduce her soon, please feel free to chat them in. We are looking at the feed and we'd love to hear from you as well. But I do want to introduce our other panelist, Anzala. Anzala Bialosia is the Executive Director of Youth Development and the Albany YMCA with the Capital District YMCA. She leads the Albany YMCA, which serves approximately 3,000 members throughout the city of Albany and beyond, with programs and services centered on youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. I mean, talk about when we're talking about younger cohort, social responsibility, all of that. I mean, great. Anzala also leads the association's youth development programs. Formerly, she was the vice president of Girl Scouts of Northeastern New York. She presents leadership development and empowerment trainings and workshops across the country. And she also spent several years representing survivors of domestic violence with immigration issues and has worked on national and local anti-violence against women legislation and policy. So Anzala, welcome. Really, really glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you.
Yeah. I know that some of the data from here, and I know that you attended the last luncheon as well. A lot of it is sobering, eye-opening, multitude of adjectives that could be described to describe that. But what have your thoughts been generally with Eve's presentation today as a mother, as a woman, as someone who has been involved with those circles in domestic violence and policy?
So I think Dr. Walter captured it just a little bit earlier. I've read this presentation several times. I've looked at this data several times, and each time I hear it or process it, it is a gasp. And it is very sobering, but I think it's important for us to illuminate this information. And I also think that it really does challenge an American cultural philosophy that we are far more progressive when it comes to gender issues, gendered equity issues. And I think, a poll and the results of surveys such as this really show us where we really are. And, this is obviously mirrored by the experiences of women. And, as I work in a community setting, serving the community, it isn't shocking, but it is in terms of when you see it on paper, you see it in print, you see the numbers, and then you also then have an ability to unpack it in terms of age and life experiences and what that really means. And it means that we have a lot of work to do, that we aren't as progressive as we believe we are, and that this victim blaming culture really is a women blaming culture. And it starts relatively very young. So there's a lot of work to be done around that. So I think those are some of my initial reactions to the data and the survey, and also what work needs to continue, especially on the policy front, and especially connecting the dots on what these deeply held beliefs, how they impact policy progression and policy implementation and policy development that actually affects the daily lives of people. So we absolutely need to do a job making sure that we connect those dots for folks.
Definitely. Well, let's start unpacking a little bit, shall we? So for both of you, I have the question, and you both touched on it a little bit, particularly with the women's movements that we've seen in the last couple of years. Are these kind of results in terms of the domestic violence and the intimate partner violence, are these surprising in 2020?
we probably both say no because we've been in the world for so long. This is the thing is people see partner violence as a private thing that happens in the home. And so very often what's happening outside, the marches, are they people can separate them. They can see the marches as their one thing in women's rights and women's movements. And yet what happens inside a home is the privacy of that, what's happening in that home. And it's very hard to chip away at that.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think there's a disassociation. So you have these movements that are very visible. You have communities and people participating in them, but then there's a disassociation from your very own personal space, your four walls, what happens. And I know we'll talk about this a little later, but especially as it relates to young adults and the understanding that what happens in your intimate partner relationships is private. And it's also, whatever the relationship dynamic that is created between these two individuals, right? So, and it's not for public digest, it's not for external digest or even external direction or guidance. So I think I agree wholeheartedly. Unfortunately, it's not surprising.
I'd also add, this is where the implicit bias comes in, because there are studies that say, do you think domestic violence is wrong or intimate partner violence is wrong? And people are, if you ask them that way, they'll say, yes, we think it's wrong. And they have no problem answering that kind of explicit question. But when you ask them these implicit questions, that's when it shows up that they don't necessarily feel it's wrong. And so I think too often what happens is the way we do it is in this very explicit way, like, should this be stopped? But if we don't get to what's in people's hearts, we're not going to really move with the dial.
And Dr. Walter, I think that's a really good point, because if you dial that down, what are those specific behaviors that even constitute domestic violence, right? So most people would say it's being physically beaten, and and that's how they would qualify or characterize domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But it isn't the verbal abuse, it isn't economic abuse, it isn't reproductive, denying or taking the birth control away from a partner in the relationship, or even, phone plans, who's controlling a phone plan in a family, and access to phone services and communication. So I think, clarifying and being very specific, which I think your poll does and takes an attempt at, is that you have to be very, very specific, because most people would agree domestic violence is wrong. Beating may be wrong, but it's also qualified, right? But what is the full range of intimate partner abuse? What does that look like inside of a relationship?
Right, those are both really good points, and language matters. I mean, I think that this poll shows that language matters. The way that you ask questions matters. Eve, one question for you that came through on Facebook was is one that kind of goes into the backbone of it. Were women of color included in all age groups in this survey?
Yes. So, it's very challenging with 52 questions to figure out exactly what to look for or what to talk about in a small Facebook presentation. So we asked not only women of color, but there's a lot of different subcategories that we're exploring that we find out about the individual, so that we can look at the differences based on those. They just, we try to limit it to a few slides for this, but there are other ways to get more information. I'm sure at the end, Sarah will talk about where you can find out more information. We did also add, just as a side note, and this came out in if you watch our previous presentation, is we added specific questions about the experience of women of color, but more related to the workplace, as opposed to where it was tied into the actual question. But we do have the capacity to unravel how different races, ethnicities, socioeconomic groups, whether you've been married or not, unravel that. So there's lots more to talk about.
There's a lot to unpack, which is why we have this series of of all of this, and why we're recording it too, so that people can go back and they can get a little bit more. So appreciate that question. If anyone else has questions, feel free, send them out. I'll try to get to as many as I can through this hour. But again, lots to unpack here. And something that we've all kind of discussed a little bit was going into the age range differences with this poll, because there are some items in here that are they're surprising and not surprising at the same time. Because like you had said, Eve, that implicit bias is affected by your lived experiences. So age certainly plays a part in that. So with one question, the wives could avoid being beaten by their husbands if they knew when to stop talking. The men in age ranges 18 to 45 rank much higher than their older counterparts. And then when we get back to the policy on safe reproductive health care as a priority, it's the older cohort that says it's not as important. How do we approach those audiences, the younger audiences, the older audiences, and try to get everybody on an even, I guess, playing field or an even level of understanding? Angela, because you work with youth development, what about that younger cohort? How can you, I guess, approach some of this information and get kind of reverse or correct some of that thinking?
So that's a good question. I think education, and when we're talking about implicit bias, we're talking about deeply ingrained beliefs, right? So you have to pull it all the way back to the layer of the root cause. So how does an 18-year-old deeply believe that a woman should stop talking in order, or censor herself in order to avoid being physically assaulted and beaten? And so here's where education with young people, even before 18, there's prevention work that needs to be done, and it needs to be fully incorporated into our educational curriculum. Also, in terms of home dynamics, you don't just arrive at 18 and then just, embrace this new belief. So, the prevention part and education and dismantling those beliefs of this inequity between men and women, the power construct, this question in particular, it brings me back to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez being verbally assaulted just a week ago, roughly over a week ago. And, the deeply held belief that if you're being challenged in any way, shape, or form, that you are now deserving of expletives, deserving of being demeaned and, disrespected. So prevention, one of the most concerning things for me is that we should all be very, very concerned that young adults have these beliefs, and what are we going to do even before they arrive to young adulthood to reshape how they perceive relationships, intimate partnerships, even the concept of partnerships. What does that look like? What is equity? What is equity in a partnership? What are those dynamics? And so that has to be taught in the home, but it also has to be supported in our educational system as well.
How do you even oh, sure, go ahead, Eve, please.
Okay. We are so much a society of victim blamers.
Mm-hmm.
If we blame ourselves when we're the victims, and when we see other people, we blame them. We blame people for being poor, and people who are poor blame themselves. Like we love blaming the victims. And so I think that a lot of what we're seeing in the younger cohort, or if anyone's going to be more likely to buy in that it must be the victim's fault, whether it's the person being abused or someone who's just hearing about it. And ideally, as we get older, we at least in terms of relationships, it's not a surprise that what happens is in divorced and separated relationships, they're less likely to justify these abuses, because these are women, or especially the women are like, I'm not going to take that anymore. I don't have to take that anymore. No one has to take that. While a young person doesn't quite have that language, perhaps. But I do think that as long as we're going to blame victims for everything that they experience in our society, we have to start with that, or this problem will not get resolved.
So I think in terms of that, those are two very big conversations to have with two different populations. So Angela, when it comes to, trying to develop that education, trying to develop the programming, what would you make the first step for some of the young people in the capital region? How would you even start approaching that? Because I feel like if you had, mind changing 101, I'm not sure how if that would be very attractive to a bunch of young kids. But how would you go about bringing that about?
So that's a great question. So part of the work that I do on a regular basis are programs designed specifically for high school students. Sometimes we do have middle school students participating. The themes and the focal points of these programs are about leadership development, positive self-identity development, character development, and making it being very, very intentional of weaving these concepts and weaving these issues into the work that we do with them on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, to have them to even start questioning, why do you believe what you believe? Dr. Walter, you're absolutely right. When you're talking to high school girls who may be in relationships and they don't have the language to name what they're experiencing, they oftentimes are convinced that it isn't wrong, but they inherently and feel wrong. They feel like what is happening to them is not right. How do we have those conversations without labeling it, shifting your mindset or something like that? But, we incorporate it into our program. We have, parts on relationships. And it's interestingly enough, these are the topics where they want to spend the most time. We'll talk about financial literacy. We'll talk about, developing a plan for college and, navigating, your academia. But the time they want to spend the most time on navigating relationships, understanding how to develop healthy relationships, with this younger group, toxic relationships is all, and it's not, and I don't want to say it's trendy, but it's good that, they are starting to ask themselves questions about what are healthy dynamics in a relationship, not just in an intimate partner relationship, friendships, family members, all of that. So being very intentional about including that and making it an important part of any kind of program serving young people.
Sure. And Eve, when you had brought up this culture of victim blaming, how do we go about reversing that? I mean, that's something that I feel has been around for decades and decades and decades. So how do we go about, is it changing policy? Is it finding ways to amplify and magnify things like the vow poll? How would you go about kind of amplifying that this is not necessarily the best direction, the best perspective to be taking? Let's reverse it, especially because it feels so ingrained.
Yeah, well, I think that I have a few answers for that, or a few levels of things that we can do. First of all, if anyone ever says that they're experiencing any kind of uncomfortable dynamic in a relationship or any type of victimization, it's our job to say, we believe you. That's it. We believe you, and what can we do for you? They'll probably say nothing. Not nothing. They'll say they don't want you to do anything, but that automatically tells them you believe what they have to say. It's amazing how many people experience this who hold on to it for so long because they think it's their fault or they think they asked for it. And so the first step is that we say we believe you. I think that there's this misnomer that by saying that we believe the victim must mean that we're immediately implicating the person who did it. They're two separate things. We can, this whole like innocent till proven guilty, and we have all these changes in education laws where in the colleges where we have to give the person accused the right. We can tell somebody, we believe you, we believe this has happened, and how can we help you? And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're just going to lock somebody up without even being sure that they did it. They're just separate. So we can see them as separate. We can deal with someone's rights as who's accused, and still just tell someone who did it, what do you need right now? And so we have to change that mentality completely, where anyone who says I'm experiencing any kind of victimization, that we're saying we believe you. And I think we can teach that language to all different age groups. The other thing is this also goes into sort of bystander or social. This is all about social perceptions. That when people see these kinds of abuses happening around them, they often keep quiet. And research has shown that most people who witness this kind of stuff, these kinds of abuses, even in a more subtle level like emotional abuse, calling the partner names, most people feel they're wrong. And because no one says anything, most people think they're the only ones who think that. And so we need to tell victims, we believe you no matter what. And we need to tell people who engage in this behavior, that's not okay with us. It's just not okay with us. And I think if we just do those two things, we could do a lot.
Right, for sure, yes. We've got a question from Facebook from Nell. Thank you, Nell. She asks, or Nell asks, wouldn't you think that children, boys and girls, should be taught from birth in the home by their parents to have equal concern for each other, and that parents should pattern best practices in the home to the children as they grow? So I think that's a very interesting statement from Nell, and you're both mothers too. So how would this conversation go, even with younger children, younger than the teenage years, Anzala, that you might interact with? So for both of you, how would you approach this conversation with even younger children?
Want me to start, or you want to start?
You want to start? Go ahead.
No, I think that the mistake that people make is they think that that actions speak louder than words, or that they don't need to actively talk about it. Like, so you have to feel comfortable having these conversations with your kids very openly, and really to not assume that, well, they never see anything like this in our house, and they know we respect everybody, they know this, so they'll respect. You have to actually have these conversations, because we have to undo years and years of problems. And so if you're a parent and you're not sitting your kids down and saying, this is not okay, and this is okay, and this is how you know, and this is what you should do, very, very specifically, and at a very young age, don't assume that you're doing anything. Because you have to be comfortable being direct. You have to be comfortable being direct, talking about sex and sexuality and relationships and violence and drugs and all those things. If you're going to be passive about it, don't be surprised if you find out that that your kids ultimately get involved in those kinds of things.
I agree, Dr. Walter. I would say, as a mother of 4, I have 3 boys and a girl. And, it's very, very intentional about having these conversations from when they were very young, putting models in front of them, ways to be, and, not being shy and very direct about, what is healthy and, what is equitable and what does that look like. And, one of the things that I can say is that it's not a one-time conversation, because it changes over time, especially as they grow. And, you don't live in a bubble. So you have what, the standards and the values and the morals of your home, your household, and then they go out into the big, big world where they're bombarded with images and dialogue and, constant, different models of what the world looks like and what people think and do and feel. And so you have to always bring it back to the conversation and work through it with them. I've had many of challenging conversations with my own sons, who are now 13, 15, and 18. But it's in those conversations that, again, hopefully I am shifting the way that they will arrive at answering a poll when they are 18, 26, 35. But it's hard work, and, it isn't for the faint of heart. And it does begin in the home, but we cannot discount, the external world and all of the narratives that they will receive in school from their peers, in other environments that they might be involved in, and having to pull back and ask them lots of questions about how they think about things, how they process things, and what conclusions they may arrive at.
Definitely. Nell, thank you. If anyone else has questions, we're funneling them through, so feel free and ask. And Ansela, you kind of shifted into a topic that I wanted to ask you, because looking at some of these survey questions and these poll questions, men answered in a way that a lot of the women didn't answer. And a lot of men might think, oh, these are women's issues. Why do I have to answer in any kind of affirmative or negative or anything like that? So a lot of the younger men in these poll questions specifically, answered with disagree or neutral to paid maternity leave and safe, affordable daycare policy. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of broach those specific topics that could be seen as, oh, this is something for a mother to figure out, or this is something for women to figure out, to get them thinking differently?
So, I think it's been said a couple of times over that it doesn't become real or important until it impacts you directly, right? And so that's where we see the shift with older males saying, oh, no, that is important because, I live in this household. It doesn't impact, our family's finances and even daily functionings. But I think that the right question is how do we get to the place where the livelihood of a family structure, however it is set up and structured, is one of mutual concern, mutual care. I remember very early in this work, we talked about the second shift, working women, and then, you go home and then you have the second shift because the burden and the full responsibility of the well-being, the caretaking, and also the livelihood rest on mom or the woman in the relationship. And how do we design relationships, intimate relationships, where there is a more balanced approach, that when you have these policy issues that will absolutely affect every single person living in a household, that it is embraced at the first blush of what this policy, what this means. So I think, it is part of, again, the education. It's also dismantling some of the systems that, are currently set up where it is, a woman's responsibility, a mom's responsibility. Childcare is, singularly, supported by the mom figuring out what to do, who takes the days off if a child is sick. All of these things matter. And so I think that's, the starting point.
I'd add that it also, it's sort of the other side of the same coin that says what happens in the family is no one else's business. Whether
it might be me, but is Eve a little frozen?
I think a little frozen.
Okay, no worries. All right, Eve, I'm going to shift just a little bit. And once we get you back, then I've got another question for you after that. Oh, I think we've got Eve back. Hi, Eve.
I got bad service over here.
No worries. No, but you were just saying it was kind of the other side of the coin. Can you go back into?
Oh, I guess I didn't know where I got lost. Rambling on in Nowhereville. Other side of the coin of it's nobody else's business what goes on inside the family's home. So if it's nobody else's business, if he's beating his wife, it's nobody else's business if she needs affordable childcare or reproductive, it's all that same idea that there's this, the government shouldn't be involved. No one should be involved if it's in the privacy of the home.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And Eve, that actually dovetails to a question that I had for you in terms of the older cohort that was asked some of these questions and the way that they answered, particularly with the survey questions on family planning and children. Is there a way to communicate with some of the people in those older age brackets that such policies are important, for the population overall, and like it doesn't have to just focus on them?
Well, I mean, implicit bias is a tough thing to change. And I think more my point is that what we don't realize is our real life experience at that time is going to influence our implicit bias. I think the fact is we need to have conversations about implicit bias, and we need to have conversations about what people are actually believing so that we can unravel that more with all of those different age groups. Because I think that if you even walked up to one of the same older person who responded that way and asked the question in a much more explicit way, they probably would have answered different. And so, one of the challenges is that we often don't look at implicit biases. I mean, this is happening with gender, it happens with race, it happens with a lot of the different isms, is that we're not really getting into what people are holding deep in their heart that they wouldn't necessarily say out loud. And so, I think that it sounds like a cop-out, but the first step for changing this is to actually speak it out loud. We have to say that people are feeling this way. People hold these biases. And until we say that, we can't really go to the next level.
Sarah, let me also just dovetail on that about, why these policy impacts are everyone's concern. When we talk about, for example, affordable childcare, I think it's sort of a new concern of employers who are now again connecting the dots that if their employees don't have a affordable childcare and have to be home, that impacts business. And so sometimes it is simplifying it, even though it shouldn't take that. But how do you make this policy relevant for all sectors of our communities and the livelihood of our communities as well?
Angela is much more optimistic than I am.
I know.
Well, I guess in that, because I also love a forward spin, I love a little bit of optimism in here. To the people who are watching this right now, and we're having this conversation about implicit bias, and we're kind of putting it out there. But what would you like to see the people who see this video? What would you like to see them do? And kind of how would they be able to raise up their own megaphone in their own way to get the message out there? Like, we need to combat some of these implicit biases.
I always encourage people to ask these questions. Steal my questions. I stole many of them from someone else. So sit at the table with your family, your children, your parents, your friends, and ask some of these questions and see what they answer. And then you have that conversation. So, these might be a little bit tougher, but there's one question I have, which is, are males, are they implicitly, I don't think I use the word implicit, I'm just stuck with that word in my head, but are they innately better in math and science than females? And you'd be surprised how many people, male and female, agree with that. And so there are some other questions like that that can be asked where they don't realize what they are thinking might be wrong. They're just like, oh yeah, no, of course they are, and then it sort of allows you to have the rest of the conversation about, well, why do you feel that way and where does that all come from? And so I think that, really asking these questions of each other and asking them of yourself, what you really think, would be really important.
Angela, what are your thoughts? What are the next steps?
So I think, again, being very intentional and direct about asking these very, very difficult questions, because, at least you'll have a baseline and a starting point of where you need to go in terms of a upward trajectory for change. And I am an optimist. So, and I also think that, in terms of our different environments and the policy issues are so important. And, I'm fortunate because I work with the Capital District Ymca. And one of the questions when we are talking about programs and services is, what do people need? right? And so what does this mean? So for childcare, for example, what does it mean? What does it mean for staff? What does it mean for our members? What does it mean for our community at large? And we have to be willing to ask those questions and keep going throughout all of the layers and, across all variables in order to come up with something that really gets to the heart of the matter, to what people truly believe. And I'm not saying that everybody always agrees, right? So, this might be important to some, but it is completely not even on the radar of others and completely unimportant. But how do we really, move the dial to provide more support and more services that people need, and really will start getting people to really think about why you've come to believe what you do believe, and then how that impacts everything that you do every single day, from the decisions you make at work to what you do at home, to the behaviors you exhibit in your intimate partner relationships, how you raise your children. So I think that is, a starting point.
Definitely. Is this something, will you be bringing the View on Women poll to the dinner table, Angela, with your sons and daughter?
I did.
You did? Okay.
Oh, I did. Like I said, it was very spirited. So, I'm fortunate because they engage me in these conversations, and I listen, and I try to not judge when I'm hearing something that makes me cringe a little bit. But I ask them the question, well, why? I just keep asking why. So
to deepen the understanding on your part.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sure. No, thank you. And we are coming a little bit toward the end of our time, but Eve or Angela, was there anything else within these questions that we didn't bring up in this conversation that you want to share with those that are watching?
I guess I would can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Again, it goes out. I think that what I would really hope beyond everything else that we talked about is that we all recognize that we hold these implicit biases as well. Everyone listening to this, me, Angela, Sarah, we all hold them. We hold these biases about not only women, but we hold them about men, we hold them about people of color, we hold them about people with, like, we walk around holding implicit biases about everybody. And it is important for us to know, where did they come from? Why are we thinking that way about the people when we see them? We look at what they look like and we decide information about them. And none of us are free of that. We are all guilty. And I think really learning how to check yourself and understand which ones are we walking around holding, and how is that playing a part? How's that playing a part at work? How's it playing a part with friends? How's it playing a part in our families? But we're walking around with them too. So no one's free of them. And I think that that's important.
I'll echo that sentiment, that self-examination is critical. And it's the only way that we will begin to start doing this very hard work. This work is not easy, and it's not going to change, after one workshop that you might attend. It won't change after a year, but we can make these small but meaningful changes in our own personal lives, with the people that we connect with on a regular basis, in our workspaces, and our families and our friends. And I think that that's where we need to start. And I also think that we need to really look at, from wherever we sit, this victim blaming culture has to end. And I think it can simply begin with believing someone when they tell you what they're experiencing and offering to support them. So most importantly, I think we can start there.
And I'll add, the Me Too movement is great in that way, in that I think the more people who talk about their actual lived experience, the more people who experience them can recognize they're not alone, and hopefully it's not their fault. But I think that we need to be more open talking about it. Programs in schools should openly talk about partner violence and sexual assault and rape, in addition to talking about what alcohol does to you. Like,
absolutely,
you should have those conversations. People should feel comfortable. If you've had these experiences yourself and you share them with your daughter or son, that's going to be really have a huge impact, so that they know this is not okay that it happened, but it's not abnormal. So many of us walk around feeling like our victim, the things that have happened to us were just ours, and that it's something wrong with us and something weird with us. And because we don't talk about these things, we never talk about any of these topics openly.
Right. Well, let's hope that, I mean, this is the second of our third View on Women conversations. Let's hope that this gets people thinking a little bit more introspectively, opens up those levels of communication. So please, those who are watching, take this video, take some of the slides that Eve has presented with us today, and have that conversation like Ansela did with her children. Or, if there was anybody that you think could benefit or have their eyes opened a little bit, share it with them, and let's start a conversation, not just a one-sided conversation either, really get a dialogue going. So I want to thank Eve. I want to thank Ansela. Thank you both so much for taking the time. For those who are interested, our next conversation will be August 18th, led by Executive Director of Women at Work, Susan Mahalik, on women in politics, policy, and leadership. Dr. Walter will be joining us there, as well as Dorsey Apliers. You can sign up at valpol.eventbrite.com. And we want to thank again the College of St. Rose Women's Leadership Institute, the Martin Group, and our corporate partners. And thank you all for joining us today. I know that time is a commodity right now, so we appreciate you taking the time with us today. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the conversation.